That is not dead which can eternal lie, and with strange eons a podcast shall rise. H.P. Lovecraft, Weird Tales, Ramsey Campbell, Cthulhu, Laird Barron, Silent Hill, Brian Lumley, Dagon. There's something sinister out there in the cosmos, and the tendrils run deep throughout the universe. Only one woman dares to traverse the web. Mary SanGiovanni, who once again is up to cosmic shenanigans.
Hi folks, welcome to Cosmic Shenanigans. This is Mary SanGiovanni, and I am up to some real-world shenanigans of cosmic proportions this week. That's right, we talked about Lovecraft last week, and as I mentioned early on in the episode, I believe it was last week, I am going to be getting back into some longer works of cosmic horror literature, but I figured before I do that, I'd like to talk about some real-world cosmic horror, as we sometimes do, where we theorize that possibly cosmic horror, as almost envisioned by Lovecraft and certainly possibly envisioned by writers since Lovecraft, may actually be existing in the mysteries of the real world, and how it's possible that science is going to prove before long that the world is a lot more cosmically mysterious and even possibly horrific than we already know. One of the subjects I've found interesting lately and have been doing some research on for an upcoming book that I'm co-writing with somebody is the concept of people going missing, particularly in national parks and woodlands and the great outdoors. Now, a lot of times when people go missing, as eerie and often tragic as such a phenomenon actually is, there are a lot of real-world possibilities that can explain their disappearances. Many times the people who go missing are of ill health, either mentally or physically, and are either unprepared for the environmental conditions that they find themselves in, or unprepared for, getting lost and being lost as long as they actually are. So there are occasions where, unfortunately, suicide or exposure to the elements, or accidents, falling off cliffs, things like that, are the reasons why people go missing. Animals, in their nature, sometimes they get to the remains before people can find them. And, if you're even left with a scattering of bones, the cause of death can often be undetermined. But what I tend to focus on, and I hope to do so, in a way that I am conveying that while these are real person missing cases, I mean no disrespect to the families or to the missing people themselves in offering this as a possible theory. I don't mean it so much as a joking around theory that they may have disappeared into other dimensions, but I'm including their stories here not just for the purpose of introducing the idea that it's possible that when people go missing, they go someplace we can't even fathom. But also, of course, in case you are interested in these cases, that you can look them up, and if you did have any information and could help people locate them, that would be awesome. Now, that disclaimer being said, as I mentioned, I think that there is a certain cosmic horror aspect to the idea of missing people in general. I wrote about it in a novella called Fremi, which is currently available on Amazon if you wanted to check it out. But the idea is that there are certain missing persons cases that have existed throughout history for hundreds of years, really, where people go missing in circumstances that seem impossible to explain. As I said, sometimes if a person goes missing and is out of sight for 3-4 hours or days or months, it could explain, there could logically be a reason why people lost track of them. But there are many cases where a person disappears nearly under the nose of people around them. And a lot of times they can't explain how or when this person seems to have disappeared because they never seem to have been out of sight of the people around them. There are other cases where, given the circumstances, there's no possible way that the person could have done this to him or herself. It's not likely that someone else did anything to them. And there's no evidence of what could have happened other than some odd pocket of the universe or of reality opening up and just swallowing this person whole. So, and I find this, an interesting prospect. As we've talked about in science, the idea of other dimensions existing, other planes of reality, overlapping our own or bumping up against our own, is not completely outside the realm of scientific possibility. And so, although we have no definitive means, at least no healthy and efficient and, a means that can be, repeated in a lab of moving from one dimension to another, then it sometimes, it doesn't mean that it isn't possible to do it. And as most scientific things are discovered, it's possible that the people who are doing it accidentally. I think that where the horror of this exists is that we may be running into a mystery. And by dimensions, I don't just mean, the 3 dimensions that we're of, the fourth if you include time. I'm talking about other worlds, like doorways to actual other planes of existence, other universes. And I think that's what's meant by dimensions here, to be clear. If that's the case, there are infinite possibilities of what can exist beyond those worlds, whether good or evil or completely indifferent. And the fact that these people don't come back is an indifference of multiverses, a horror of multiverses in and of itself, that there's no trace of them, or that what little trace there is makes no sense. The horror of people gone missing is a horror above and beyond us to begin with. And I think that to add that extra layer to it, that extra idea that maybe it's because they've disappeared into an entirely other world, populated by things that may not even function along the same laws of physics that we do, is absolutely terrifying. So I'm going to give you some examples. These are some, if you, they're fairly, I say that they're fairly common examples in the sense that most websites who tackle the idea of missing people having been abducted by aliens or somehow who have run into Bigfoot or as I'm postulating here, have gone through portals to other worlds, that these are the ones I think that seem to be the most mysterious unsolved missing persons cases, and the ones whose conditions, as I mentioned earlier, in this episode, as I mentioned earlier, are so strange that the normal theories, even the stranger normal theories of what could happen to people who have gone missing, don't appear to fit. And in fact, we could even go so far as to say that possibly one of the only mysteries that fits, short of these things never having happened in the first place as related to people, is that they have gone to some other place. The first one is a story of a man from the 1760s, because we can actually go at least that far back, and talk about a man named Owen Parfitt. He lived in the English town of Shepton Mallet, and He lived in a small house with his sister. He was unable to walk or really do much of anything on his own because of disease. He had a very debilitating disease, and his sister took care of him. She helped him move inside, outside the house, helped him go to the bathroom, that sort of thing. He had a chair right outside their front door, where he often sat when the weather was nice, and just took in the fresh air. And his sister, of course, had to move him to this chair and from this chair. And one day, in the 1760s, he was sitting right outside in his chair, and his sister had gone in, to do something, and she came outside to move him again, I guess, ostensibly back into the house. But in the chair, she only found that a coat that her brother had been using to, cover himself like a blanket to keep warm. So then she thought, well, maybe a neighbor had moved him. But when she looked, he was nowhere in the house. He was nowhere around the house. None of the neighbors said that they had seen him or moved him anywhere. And no one ever saw him again. The fact that he could not walk on his own, and that nobody in the area claims to have helped him move, has led to theories over time that maybe he was swallowed by some hiccup between worlds in dimensions, or that something came from some other place and moved him. Many of the cases I'm going to relate to have that strange quality to it, that there seems to be no other explanation except another dimension. We have the story of Brian Schaefer, who disappeared in April 2006. Brian Schaefer was a medical student at Ohio State University, and there's actually some video of this. You can find some video online of this particular incident, in that he met several friends at a bar one night. He was last seen sometime around 2 a.m. when witnesses saw him talking to some women at the bar. And then after that, his friends lost track of him. They assumed that he had picked up a girl and gone home. They realized that he was no longer anywhere in the bar, and so they left. But the fact is that Brian never made it home. He never made it outside the bar. He basically just vanished. And the strange part of this is that you can see the security cameras that are at the entrance. Apparently, it was the only way in or out of this bar, the only door, at least as far as they know, the only door accessible to patrons. But I'm pretty sure that in other stories, other versions of the story I've read, it was the only door, period, in the bar. It wasn't the kind of bar that had windows. The only way in and out was through this security camera entrance, where the cameras were, basically monitoring who was coming in and coming out. You can find the police found the footage of this, the security camera. And what you see is that in looking at this footage, he goes into the bar, but he's never come out. There is no footage whatsoever of him ever leaving the bar, and yet he was nowhere on the premises. Investigators found no evidence of foul play. He seemed to be in good spirits, that there was no idea of suicide, or anything that would indicate that he wanted to disappear from his life. He just vanished. Then we have a couple of cases where people are on moving vehicles, and that they have disappeared off of moving vehicles. And I find this kind of crazy, okay? Again, I suppose if you were going to take a hard, real-world approach to this, you could say, well, maybe they never got on these vehicles in the first place. However, according to both of these stories that I'm going to relate, there were witnesses that saw them on these vehicles, and then they just disappeared, okay? And again, I'll postulate a theory about what I think is going on with these other dimensions when this happens. But we've got somebody in 1890, in September of 1890, we have Louis Le Prince. Louis Le Prince was the inventor of the motion picture, even though Thomas Edison, as we found out, had done with many things, ended up taking credit for this invention after Le Prince disappeared. Edison was not responsible for this disappearance as far as we can tell, but he disappeared from a train in in France in September 1890. He had gone to visit his brother in Dijon, and he boarded a train to go back to Paris. There were several witnesses that mentioned that they had seen him on the train, and the train had made no stops between Dijon and Paris. That's important. He could not have jumped out of the window of his compartment because the windows were locked from the inside. And, which means that had he unlocked them, there was nobody to relock them again. And the police searched the countryside between Dijon and Paris anyway, but they never found any trace of the missing man. When the train got to Paris, he did not get off the train. He was simply gone. In a similar case, James E. Tedford, who was a vet, and a retired vet, had mysteriously vanished in November of 1949. He had boarded a bus in St. Albans, Vermont, where he'd been visiting family, and he was taking the bus back to Bennington, where he lived in a retirement home. Now, according to this particular source, which I think is Strange Outdoors, I think was where I found it, or Mysterious Universe was one of the other ones. 14, again, I've seen this case come up in a number of times, and they said 14 passengers saw Tedford on this bus, sleeping in his seat, after the last stop before Bennington. So right up until the stop before Bennington, and after this, they saw him on this bus. But when the bus arrives in Bennington, he's gone. All his stuff is still there. All of his belongings were still in the luggage rack, but he was gone. And what's even weirder, he was a World War II veteran. When he returned from the war, he returned to find that his wife had vanished years before and that their property had been completely abandoned. So there's a theory, that maybe from whatever dimension she disappeared into, she came and got him, which would be a kind of cute little love story if that was the case, but still creepy in that, we have two cases here of people on moving vehicles that have disappeared literally out from under the noses of people on those same vehicles. This one I think is a little bit sad. We have, and this is a fairly common outdoors nature park type story. It's there have been at least two other similar stories with young kids who have had the same experience. One of whom literally disappeared off the top of a cliff, and another who disappeared from a group of friends on a trail in the woods. But this particular story is about Thelma Pauline Melton, who was also called Polly. Thelma was a 58-year-old woman who was a little overweight, but enjoyed the great outdoors. They mentioned that she was a little overweight because her friends were teasing her that she was having trouble keeping up with them. But at some point, she disappeared while hiking with two of her friends in September of 1981. They were hiking in the Great Smoky Mountains. They were on an easy trail that Melton was very familiar with. She'd done it before. She was walking a little bit ahead of her companions, and so she rounded an upcoming bend, which they said I think was about 50 yards away, so it wasn't particularly far. But when the friends rounded that same bend, she was gone. They said she suffered from high blood pressure, so it's not likely that she could have suddenly run off. And they didn't find her anywhere off trail. She just completely disappeared. Okay? And again, I think it's possible, particularly in woodsy outdoor areas, that maybe, just maybe, these places, because they are often less traveled, or because they're out of the way and they're sort of secluded and private, that it's possible maybe that there are these areas where these portals to other dimensions open up. It's possible that creatures who want to access this world maybe want to come in quietly, and that's how they do it. They come in wilderness areas where they're not likely to run into huge crowds of people as they emerge from wherever it is they're coming, or whether they go back to wherever they're going, and possibly people stumble on these. We have another case of a woman getting lost in the Blue Mountains of Australia. Her name was Elizabeth O'Prey. She was 77. She went missing in March of 2016. She was walking one of the trails when she got lost. Her family reported her missing after one day. They managed to call her on her phone. She said she was fine, but she had no idea where she was. And a few days later, when they were able to locate the area where she had been, this is what I find creepy, residents and police heard screams for help, but they still could not find her and have not found her to this day. Now, at the time she disappeared, she was taking stroke medication. It could cause confusion. It could explain how she'd gotten lost. She could have become disoriented, but it doesn't explain how they were able to talk to her and hear her. Okay? Because they could hear her crying for help and yet not be able to see her. To me, I think if we were going with the concept of people just slipping into other dimensions or other pockets of reality, particularly ones that overlap our own. This is very much a Lovecraftian idea that there's a world that overlaps ours that we just can't see, and that sometimes people slip into it. We have another primary example of a story that sounds impossible, but is a fairly straight up example of a number of stories very similar to it. And I find this, of all these stories, perhaps one of the most disturbing, partly because I am familiar with the area, and partly because of the frightening ease with which this happened. Martha Wright disappeared in 1975. She and her husband, Jackson, were driving from New Jersey to New York. I have made this trip countless times. They were driving through the Lincoln Tunnel. Okay? Now, I can tell you for a fact that the Lincoln Tunnel is amply lit in such a way that it would be very difficult to disappear from any place except one end or the other end of the tunnel. Okay. But they were driving through the Lincoln Tunnel, and the couple had to pull over because there was a lot of condensation on their car windows. Okay. Now that seems strange to me in and of itself because, again, having driven through the Lincoln Tunnel, there really isn't any condition in the tunnel itself that would cause condensation to the point where you'd have to stop it, especially from the outside of the car. I mean, a lot of people, especially in the 70s, because I can remember when I was a kid, they told us when you're going through the Lincoln Tunnel or the George Washington Bridge, when you're going through those tunnels, to roll your windows up. And that was because there is no ventilation there. There are no windows. There are no other doors. And the exhaust from all the cars, before they had such emissions, protocols in place, could be a lot. So you'd roll your windows up. But even as a kid, I can't ever remember a situation where even doing that with 5 of us in a car caused enough condensation that we had to pull over. But they said there was a lot of condensation on the car windows. They pulled over, and Jackson agreed to wipe the condensation off the front windshield. Martha agreed to wipe the condensation off the back windshield. So they had gone to opposite ends of the car, and when Jackson had cleared his windshield, he looked up to find that his wife was gone. Now, this could only have taken minutes, okay, to clear a windshield. And again, I'm telling you this as somebody who has been there. There is no place a person could run to in the middle of the Lincoln Tunnel. There are tiny little service doors that maybe a child could fit through it. I'm not even sure where they go. I don't think they go any place a person can hide, and they're locked, okay? You would hear echoing the footsteps of anybody who was walking around the Lincoln Tunnel, if that was the case. You would have heard Martha or an attacker or whatever in the tunnel. You would have seen another car pull over. There was nothing like this that had happened. There was no indication, no sound, no footsteps, no trace of this woman at all. It is as though she had just completely vanished from the spot. And this is not the only case of this kind. There was a case probably 100 years before that of something very similar happening with a horse and carriage in the 1800s. The idea that just a vehicle's length could separate you and a person could disappear right from that area, again, would just suggest that somebody has slipped off into a pocket of some other world. Because there's no physics explanation. There's no science explanation that would make a whole lot of sense in these particular situations. We have a story of a 19-year-old college student from Minnesota named Brandon Swanson. He disappeared in May of 2008. This one I find a little bit sad. I feel genuinely sympathetic for his parents. But the odd nature of the situation, warrants examination, I think. As I mentioned, he was a college student. He was on his way home from a night out with friends when he accidentally ran his car into a ditch. I sympathize. I am not a great driver. Now, he called his parents and asked them to pick him up, but this is where it gets weird. Okay. He told his parents that his car went off the road near a town called Lind. He said he was going to walk toward the town and his parents could pick him up there. Okay. But as they approached the town, they saw no sign of him and no sign of the car. The car was later located, but it was located near a different town called Taunton, which is not even close to where Brandon said it was. I mean, they said that it would have been, I think, something like an hour's drive or something. I mean, it was a significant difference away, that it wasn't like, oh, we're right on the border of this and this. I mean, the Taunton and Lind are not near each other. They're not even close to each other. Now, the odd thing, though, is that Brandon routinely traveled the road he was on. So it's not likely that he would have been wrong about where he was. He knew where he was because he was familiar with that area. He'd gone out with friends, and he hadn't gone far. So he wouldn't have been that far off course. Now, it has also been suggested that, well, maybe he was drunk or high. He'd been out partying. But his father talked to him for a lengthy amount of time and has never indicated that his son sounded off in any way, except toward the end of his conversation. Okay, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, he called his father back, and they were on the phone for about 45 minutes while his parents were trying to locate him. And he was talking, he said he was fine, he was walking, and then suddenly he said, "Oh shit," and then the line went dead. Now, it's possible, authorities seem to think that he fell into a nearby river. But when his parents called him back, his phone kept ringing. That wouldn't have happened if he'd fallen in the river, because the phone would have just gone immediately to voicemail. The water would have, I think, done some damage to the phone. All of those calls went unanswered. Brandon has never called, and they have never found him since. Okay? It is again, and what I think is strange about this particular case is that he could be so off geologically. There are a lot of stories about missing kids or missing people in general, particularly, again, usually in wooded areas where evidence shows that the missing person has traveled a great distance over a very short period of time in a condition that would not seem physically possible. In some cases, they find, and this is most often with children, they will find the child, say, 30, 40, 50 miles away, sometimes barefoot or not dressed for the extreme temperatures that they would have traveled through over the course of the night, and that they have covered, a distance that their little legs probably wouldn't have been able to take them, which would lead one possibly to theorize that maybe the door you enter, if you are ever lucky enough to exit, a door from another dimension, that it's not always the same door that you entered. Sometimes you exit a different door than you entered, and it puts you in a different place. First of all, if that's the case, then there are far more of these doors than we think of, far more of these portals. and that we're going in and out of places. And the fact that people usually are eerily calm when they're found and often can't recall where they've been, suggests that, I think a whole host of psychological cosmic horror that can be trapped in those minds about what happened during those missing hours. But as I mentioned, I think what's odd here is that the boy, his car was somehow very far away from where he thought he was, and there are theories that some of these other dimensions may look like places but are not quite the same. The final story we have is also, sadly, about a young boy. He was 10. He disappeared in 1974, and his name was Damien Mckenzie. The idea, again, is that Damien's case is fairly common in terms of these kinds of cases. The details are alarmingly common, that people could disappear quite as, easily as this boy disappeared. As I mentioned, his name is Damien. He disappeared in 1974 while on a camping trip at Victoria Falls. He was with a total of 40 students. They were going up to the top of the mountain, and there's some that say that he fell behind, that he stopped to tie his shoe, that he couldn't quite keep up, and the scoutmaster that he was with told him, "Just wait here, we'll get you on the way back down." But by the time they found him, or I should say by the time they came back to find him, he was gone. They tracked his footprints all the way up to one side of the falls, and then the footprints just stopped. There were no footprints returning. There were no footprints in any other direction. They just stopped. Nobody saw any suspicious people in the area. The canine tracking dogs were unable to pick up any scent. And if I recall, what they did find were some of his belongings, his backpack and a camera. A lot of the pictures seem to suggest on the camera that he was just taking pictures of nature as he was walking along. The other one is an extreme close-up. The very last one is an extreme close-up of his eye. I think his eye and his nose. It was like a part of his face. They say his eye is very wide, that he looks scared. The background is very dark, and it is the only picture that was taken, from what they can tell, after he disappeared. So there we have it, folks. We have a number of missing cases, which I think suggest, despite their real world tragedy, they certainly suggest a certain aspect to the universe that is mysterious. I think that people who are inclined to believe, as I am, that it's possible that there are other dimensions out there, other worlds, and that occasionally people accidentally slip, in between them or through them or from one place to another. I think there's something a little, sort of terrifying about that, because, and again, as we've mentioned in a lot of these real world cosmic horror things, it's the cosmic horror, the horror aspect of it is the enormity of what we don't know. It's almost an opposite situation than like Lovecraft, where with Lovecraft's work, the horror was the enormity of what we had just discovered. I think in these cases, it is the cosmic scale of what could be, of what we don't know, of what may very well be out there, and we are powerless against it. We are powerless to stop it from happening, because you'd assume that in many of these cases, these people, there's nothing to indicate these people want to go missing, It's that the enormity, the scale, the cosmic scale of what could be out there brushing up against our reality every day. And that these people, I guess, like people in Lovecraft stories, whether they wanted to or not, have undertaken the discovery of whatever this grand scale thing is. that they have somehow found access to reaches beyond which we could even imagine. And that, that even on the rare instances where they're returned, they don't seem to have any more answers for us than they did before. I think it's sort of fascinating and terrifying. I think it's terrifying and tragic when anybody goes missing, but there's something sort of admittedly fascinating and terrifying about these cases which seem to defy the laws of physics in our world and suggest that maybe the universe, maybe the multiverse, maybe the complexity of places where we can possibly exist is a lot more mercurial and a lot more dangerous and a lot more fluid on a cosmic scale than we could ever have imagined before. And that sometimes those places swallow us up, and that anything could be on the other side. And from what little we've gotten from these people before they disappear, there are hints that maybe it's not a safe and completely beautiful place wherever it is that they're going. So anyway, for these families, I hope they do someday find out what happened to these people, and whether they disappeared into another dimension or not. I hope they're found safe and sound, or at least found in a way that they can finally be put to rest. And for all of you listening to this, I appreciate it. Stay safe, watch where you're going, don't go alone, and tell people where you're going if you're going somewhere. And I will see you next week for more Cosmic Shenanigans, where we talk about the great scope of cosmic mystery out there, and look at cosmic horror in all its glorious forms. All right, I will. If you are interested in Cosmic Shenanigans, I have found that sometimes I forget to mention this. If you're interested in past episodes of Cosmic Shenanigans or future episodes of Cosmic Shenanigans, you can find them pretty much any place where podcasts are available. And you may also be interested in another show that I co-host called the Ghostwriters Podcast, which airs on Thursday nights and features Summer Cannon and Matt Wilderson and Dave Thomas, two of them formerly of The Horror Show with Brian Keene, where we talk about writing advice and horror in general in movies and books and television and music, and sometimes we get up to shenanigans, perhaps not quite of cosmic proportions, but shenanigans nonetheless. So, and that podcast is available everywhere that podcasts are available, as well as, Cosmic Shenanigans. If you are interested in picking up anything of mine, particularly on this particular topic, you can try my novella For Emmy, which deals with this very thing. And then, I don't know, you tell me where these people go when they go missing, and what is it on the other side. Okay? I will talk to you all next week. Bye.
Cosmic Shenanigans. You can listen to this episode and all previous episodes for free on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, YouTube, Google Play Music, and wherever else podcasts are available. Cosmic Shenanigans is written and produced by Mary SanGiovanni. Our theme music is by Xander Harris. Our engineer is Matt Wilderson. Check out his books on Amazon.com